Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat datang kepada semuanya. Saya akan berbahasa Inggris ya. Saya switch kepada bahasa Inggris. So I would like to welcome our guests, Sarah, Ed, and Jamal and Becky. So we have four guests from University of Nottingham and also University of Cambridge. We still have place here in front. You can. It's okay to sit in this row or that row. Jangan malu-malu, don't be shy. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, after welcoming our guests, I would also like to explain that this is a guest lecture from two professors, and the students here are students from this class. It's called Biological Control and Habitat Management, and the lecturer of this course is Dr. Ruli. So Dr. Ruli is here, and Pak Ali, you've met the head of the department. So because of this is a very special occasion, Pak Ali and also the secretary of the department, we discussed whether we can make this open to more students, not only graduate, but also undergraduate. So here we have the undergraduate students, but also I can see some graduate students here. So this is a mix. And it's also online, right? Okay. Online sama PEI juga nggak? Nggak ya? Sama PEI juga? Okay. Okay. And it's also being shared with the Entomological Society of Indonesia. But I don't know how many. Do you know how many in Zoom right now? Berapa orang di Zoom? Well, anyway, doesn't matter. Berapa?
Baru 4.
Oh, baru 4. Baru 4, nanti kan tambah lagi. Okay, so before we start the guest lecture, there's an opening remark from the head of the department. And so I will let Pak Ali to present his opening remark. And then there's a little token for our two speakers from the head of the department. Okay, so Pak Ali, the time is yours. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Gami, for time for opportunity to me to give some opening remark. But I think Bu Gami already talked a lot about this stuff. Yeah. So I just want to say again, I would like to welcome to the team of the Cambridge of the University of Nottingham and the team to come here to our department, Department of Plant Protection, in collaboration with Professor Bukori and so Dr. Purnama Hidayat. And second, on behalf of our department, I would like to thanks to Professor Edgar, Turner, and also Dr. Sarah Luke for your willingness to give lecture to our undergraduate student in the biological control and habitat management course, and also this course is already open to other people. So this lecture is conducted by hybrid platform, so other people can can attend this lecture online. So and then when I see the topic, I think the topic that will be presented in this lecture are very important in enriching our student knowledge in understanding the environmentally friendly pest management practice that do not harm the environment to support sustainable agriculture for our country. So this is and lastly, for our students, enjoy this lecture and should take the lecture material seriously. That is for me, and thank you to all, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Ali. Pak Ali, would you like to say something as the lecturer for the course? You would like to say something to your students, or say hello to our guests?
Thank you. Our student is I think this is very important for our students to have another view about the how to control the body infection. I think we appreciate for your time, sharing information, sharing knowledge. I hope these our students can take advantage of your presentation. I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So maybe Pak Ali would like to present something to both Ed and Sarah. You can come up here, and also Pak Ali. And someone take picture.
Okay.
This one is for Ed. Thank you. And Pak Ali just mentioned that he later has to teach, so maybe then he needs to go. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Pak Nazir ada kursi di sini, kalau mau duduk di sini. Masih ada 2 kursi kosong, jangan malu-malu. Mahasiswa masih ada nih, kalau duduk di sini. Sayang, jangan takut sama saya. Okay, so let us start the lecture. I believe that Ed will start, so I will introduce you a little bit. Jadi saya bacakan dulu apa ya. Oh, additionally, there are 2 students here that will join the Kinibalu workshop, Aldin and Ola. So these are the 2 people who will attend your workshop. So buat yang lain, sebetulnya Pak Ed ini juga datang ke Indonesia karena akan menyelenggarakan workshop. Workshop sih pelatihan ya, training ya tentang conservation, dan itu diadakan di Kinibalu, dan kemarin ada pengumuman terbuka, terus dipilih gitu, dan kemudian di antara yang terpilih adalah Mbak Ola dan Mas Aldin di sini. Jadi mereka akan berangkat minggu depan ya, 2 minggu. 2 minggu. Ini tiap tahun ada. Jadi untuk anak-anak yang lain yang belum ikut, mungkin tahun depan bisa ikut lagi. This is every year, right? Yeah. Bisa bahasa Melayu sedikit ya. Okay. So let us introduce Professor Ed Turner. He is a professor at of insect ecology and curator of insects at the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. His main research interest is studying how to manage human-modified system to support insect diversity and related ecosystem processes. So the title of his talk here is, I would just give the time to Ed, and we have about an hour. So it depends on you what you want to manage your 1 hour. So let us give a big applause to Ed.
Okay, selamat siang semua. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the very kind introductions. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I hope you enjoy this talk and the one from Sarah afterwards as well. I've been given the job, and I'm really pleased to give you an introduction to insects. Insects is something that I particularly specialise in. So as Budami mentioned, I'm curator of insects in the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. And we're very lucky, like yourselves here, to have a museum, a collection associated with us. And this is the collection in Cambridge, and I'm responsible for the insects. We have in our collection about 2 million individual insect specimens, which have been collected over the last 200 years. So we're very lucky to use those as part of the way that we study insect biodiversity, and also part of the way we study insect conservation. You'll see here as well, we have bigger things on display as well. And we're an open museum, so we're open to members of the public. And that gives us a chance to also put on displays about our research as well. So that's where I sit in the university. So I do the research side of things. I do undergraduate teaching in Cambridge, but I also do looking after the museum collections. And I'm going to try and bring that in as I talk for the next 50 minutes or so about insects, conservation and ecology. And in particular, what I want to try and cover over the next hour or so is a bit about why insects are interesting. I think I'm probably sort of telling you all things you know already. I think you're probably all interested in insects already. You've got Budami in the department and Papa Nama. So I imagine all of you like insects. But I'm going to tell you why I like insects and why I think they're interesting. We're going to think a bit about insect kinds. So why we need to study insects to understand how we can conserve them. And then we're going to think about what we can do about it. And a lot of the work that I do, I'm involved with, and also the work we do collaboratively with Budami and Papa Nama here, about ways that the environment can be managed to increase insect biodiversity. And from your course's point of view, of course, that comes hand in hand with things like crop protection, with things like pest control, with things like pollination. So that's the shape of the talk. So first of all, just to introduce the insects. Again, most of you will know this already, but insects dominate in terms of the described biodiversity in the world, the number of described species there are. Around about, there's maybe 1.4 million named species in the world. This is a pie chart that shows more or less, it's a little bit out of date, but more or less how many named species there are by different groups. Now, if you unfocus your eyes, the things in blue are either insects or things related to insects. So we're talking probably nearly 1 million named insect species now. Huge, huge diversity out of the total. So you could say that on average, everything is an insect. I was taught this by one of my lecturers when I was in university. And he said, basically, if you want to be a good ecologist in a natural environment and you're walking through an environment and you see something on the ground, if you kick it and it's hard, it's a rock. If it's green, it's a plant. If it moves, then it's an insect. And nearly always you'll be right with that, because the vast majority of things are insects. Now, because we're large, humans are large, we tend not to see that in the environment. We tend to see bigger things like birds and mammals and things like that. But the real diversity is in insects. And one of the things that you can do to visualize that is you can make what's called a species scale, where you scale the size of organisms in a picture by the number of species there are. And if we did that for the world, this is what the world would look like. A little bit different. So what we've got here is this enormous beetle. I was really pleased to get a guide for beetles. That's really kind in the present. But beetles dominate in terms of the number of named species. Nearly 900,000 named, 400,000 named beetle species already. But that's just part of this enormous insect diversity. So insects dominate. You've also got other big groups like spiders, arachnids, and their relatives dominating. Things like us, mammals, shown here as this elephant, or birds, are really small in terms of the number of species. So this is what the world is really like. We just don't see it that way. Now, interestingly, you might think, well, okay, there are lots of different species of insects, but actually they're tiny. All of them are small. So maybe they're not really that important. But again, if you could scrape all of those insects together and weigh them, they again dominate. Ants are so numerous, they're everywhere. One of my friends works on ants, and he reckons that if you could just take a photo from space and only see the ants, you'd still see the continents, because there are that many of them. And again, you can do this. You can produce what's called a biomass scape, which is what's shown here. This is based on real data from the Brazilian Amazon. And this is based on the biomass of insects in an environment. So even though they're individually small, insects still dominate in terms of the sheer amount of stuff. So mammals are big, but they're not very numerous. Insects are small, but there's millions of them. So put all that together, and insects become very important. They become important because of their number of species, the diversity of things they do, which goes hand in hand with that, but also just because of their sheer volume. And of course, some of the things that we might be interested in insects for are things like pest control. So shown here by this beautiful assassin bug, very, very important in terms of controlling pests you all know about. Things like these weaver ants, Ecophyllus smaragdina, the longest known use of pest control in plantation ecosystems. Over 1,000 years, people have been using these. So really, really important. Of course, things like pollinators. I've got a honeybee here. We know there's a huge diversity of different pollinator species that are supporting our crop production worldwide. And of course, things like these beautiful dung beetles, responsible for that nutrient cycling within an ecosystem. So all of these things, if you lose these, of course, ecosystems will be in a real problem. And it's not just natural ecosystems, of course, it's our crops as well. So it's often said that 1 in every 3 bites of our food come from animals, come from insect pollinators. And that's really important. A huge proportion of the world's crops are supported by these insects that pollinate them for us, often free of charge. So it's absolutely critical for our livelihoods. Lose insects, we'll lose our crop production system. Interestingly, it's not just about the kind of number of bees or anything like that. It's also about the diversity of species. And that's become increasingly obvious over time, more and more studies looking at this. This is a really early one, and this is from Claire Klein and colleagues. And what they were looking at here was coffee pollination. So it's one of these studies that's now been replicated in lots of crops, and it turns out this is a very common pattern. And what they found, interestingly, was if you look at the pollen sets, so basically the coffee pollination, in relation to number of bees, so just number of bee individuals, abundance, there's not any clear pattern. But if you look in terms of the number of bee species, actually it goes up. So it's not just number of bees, it's number of bee species, which are important in supporting coffee pollination. And that's been found in lots of other crops now as well. Now, that's probably because these bees are all doing different things, it turns out. Some bees come out early in the morning, some in the afternoon, or in the midday. Some go to the edge of the coffee, some to the top, some to the bottom, some to the middle of the field, some to the edge of the field. Put that together and it means more species means more reliable pollination. So we should be worried if insect numbers start going down. We should be worried for natural ecosystems because insects are diverse and important, but also because it will impact on us. And unfortunately, of course, many of you know this already, insect numbers are going down. When you get to my age, you actually realise it. I can remember when I was a kid in my garden in the UK, and there are species of butterflies I used to see commonly when I was a child that are now no longer found there. If you found the same, as you get through your life, you suddenly start sort of seeing change yourself. And that's a really worrying thing. What it means is that for you guys, for younger generations, you won't see the same species that I did. And I find that very sad, actually. But more than just that, if you start putting this together worldwide, what you can find is that these trends are not isolated to just my garden. I grew up in the UK. These are trends that are happening worldwide. This is a global study. It was by Van Klink et al. A few years ago, and it's a meta-analysis. So it's an analysis of kind of other data sets, if you like. And what they did was they found all of the long-term insect records they could worldwide. And they put them together and they basically looked at long-term changes, not in species numbers, but in abundance, either abundance or biomass of insects. And really worryingly, what they found was that from these long-term data sets, there'd been around about a 9% decline per decade in insect abundance for terrestrial insects. That's really high, very, very high. That's again, something we should be worried about. Really interestingly, this is where the studies were based. You can kind of see there's hardly any studies in the tropics. There's none in this part of the world at all, really, apart from one in Sabah, I think. So this means we're relying on data which is not well represented in the most diverse parts of the world, which are places like Indonesia. So again, giving you a challenge here. If you could set up some long-term insect monitoring, that would be good. But this is really, really important. We need to understand what's happening here. And there's more and more projects trying to understand that. So things are worrying. And it's not just something that's happened in recent years. So those long-term data mostly date back to the 1970s, which is quite a long time, but it's not that long. You can get ideas of how much insects have changed longer term. And one of the things that you can do is you can use museum specimens. So this is a tray of beetles from the collections in Cambridge. And what we can do is, if you look at them, all of them have got these little data labels under them. And this will basically say, more or less, when the insect was collected, where it was collected, and who by. What that means is that people like me can effectively time travel. We can go back in past and we can find out where things were, not just to the 1970s, when modern records began, but 80 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And that's really, really useful because it means we can basically see how long things have been changing. We've done this for some of the collections in Cambridge. This is some data we've been collecting, both on our collections of physical specimens, the insect labels, but also written notebooks as well. We've got some beautiful journals. There's one particularly, this is a guy called Leonard Jennings who lived in Cambridge in the 1830s to the 1850s, and he kept like meticulous notes, diaries on how abundant everything was around Cambridge in those days. So kind of, 170 years ago, whatever it is. So enormous long-term data sets. And what we can do with these is we can compare them to modern records and we can see how much things have changed. It's quite interesting. We've started doing that with some of our collection. We find things in our collection, for example, this rather beautiful butterfly here is something called the large copper butterfly. It turns out this used to be common around Cambridge. It's now extinct across the whole of the UK. Something that's no longer found in the world. The only place you can see it now is in collections. So it's a big change. But this isn't isolated. When you start looking across our collections, what you find is that certain groups of species have declined or disappeared compared to modern records. And that's what's shown here. So on the top here, this is based on notebooks. And we can rank how common things are in the notebooks based on these notes. And we can rank how common they are now. And we can look at different groups. So this is a generalist butterfly. These are things that are common now and found across lots of different habitats. This is a specialist butterfly. This is found on special habitats, like just on chalk grasslands, or just in heathlands, or just in forest, somewhere that's unusual in the UK. And what we've found is, if you look at the change in abundance, common species are doing okay. Rare species have gone down. If we look at our collection data, specialist species in blue, common species in pink or red. I'm slightly colorblind. Pink. I'm going to go with pink. What we can see is the same pattern. So common species becoming more common, rare species becoming more rare. This isn't something that's just happened since modern records. It's something that's happened over the last 200 years. Again, this is important because it places modern records in context. And from a conservation point of view, it also means we can be ambitious. And I think if we're trying to make agriculture more sustainable, or we're trying to increase biodiversity, reverse the decline in biodiversity, we need to be thinking about things, not how they were in the 1970s, which, to be honest, it turns out was already bad. We need to be thinking about how things were before people had a really big impact. And museum collections are important for that. And I don't know if you feel the same, but if you see something, if you see a large copper butterfly, and you show someone it, you say, look, this is extinct. This has disappeared because of human action. It makes people much more likely to do so. So that's part of the kind of context of insect declines. Of course, there are lots of causes of insect decline worldwide. I can list a few here. I'm going to go through some of the work that I've been involved with, again, collaboratively with IPB and with Sarah and everyone. But habitat change has been the number one long term. And we're talking conversion to agriculture or intensification of agriculture, depending on what parts of the world you're in. That's the same if you're in Indonesia or if you're in the UK. That's a global driver because agriculture has increased everywhere. Introduced species, that's a major decline, driver as well. Depends a little bit on which area you're in. Pollution, Certainly pollution, pesticides have had a big impact on insects, perhaps pesticides particularly. Climate change is increasingly beginning to impact insect numbers. That's the sort of thing that your generation have got to look forward to. And these things interact. All of these different drivers are not isolated. They all interact together. So one of the things that our group tries to do is understand exactly why these things cause insect numbers and insect diversity to go down. And it's not just a question of saying, oh, it's habitat change, or it's intensification of agriculture. You need to understand exactly why that is, because by doing so, you can begin to reverse those changes. So an example here. This is real data, so it's a schematic, but it's a real data from Sabah, from Malaysia. And what we've got here is a primary forest on the left-hand side. We've got an oil palm plantation on the right-hand side. And this is looking at a transect that's been done through these areas, and the tree heights are correct. So if you go to Sabah, it's the tallest tropical tree in the world recorded in Sabah. We've got a canopy that goes up to over 80 meters. Enormous structural complexity. Oil palm plantations, even though they're very complex crops, only get up to what, 12, maybe 15 meters. And we're going from hundreds of tree species per hectare to just one. So that causes a big change in structure for insects. And for things like insects, because they operate on a really small scale, these changes can make quite a big difference to what doesn't survive. They also affect kind of how the environment works as well. And one of the things we've been doing, we've had a long-term project, both Sarah and I working in Sabah, has been working on this, which is called the SAFE project. It's the Stability of Altered Forest Ecosystems project. And for those of you going on the kind of field course to Sabah next week, this is one of the areas that we're going to be going to. And it's an interesting one. It's a horrible schematic, but don't worry too much. What the SAFE project basically is doing is it's collaboratively working with kind of hundreds of researchers, and it's looking at habitat change from old growth forest to logged forest to an experimental landscape, which I won't worry about too much here, and to oil palm plantation. So it's looking at this whole change in disturbance, and not just working on one species or one group, but working right the way across the board. So looking at forest change, structural change, carbon dynamics, insect numbers, bird numbers, mammal numbers, everything you can think of, all in one area, but collected repeatedly by different groups of researchers. And what that means is you can begin to understand how the whole habitat is changing and how these things are interacting. And I wanted to sort of give you a few examples of this to really begin to understand why converting forest to oil palm or to any crop, wherever you are in the world, why it has an impact. Because by understanding that, you can use that to inform the way you manage environments to reduce that effect. This is one of the things we found. This is work from one group who were looking particularly at carbon store and kind of dead wood and things like that in the forest environment. And what we've got here is a disturbance gradient. And we're going from zero disturbance, so this is old growth forest, primary rainforest, through to highly disturbed, which is oil palm plantation in this case. And what you can see, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the amount of carbon in live wood, so living trees, goes right down and then levels off. Interestingly, that's not the case for dead wood, because dead wood can survive for a long time in an environment. That kind of stays more or less the same. So put that together, and what it means is the importance of dead wood for storing carbon goes up. So more carbon proportionally is in dead wood in disturbed habitats than it is in live wood. It's kind of obvious, I suppose, but it hadn't been shown before. That has real impacts for insects, of course, because suddenly what it means is that those species living in living parts of surviving on living parts of the environment may be under rather more pressure than those living in dead wood parts of the environment. Again, these kind of things have impacts. And one of the things you can do when you start getting all these studies together from just one area is you can begin to get a kind of consensus view on how habitat change is affecting whole communities of animals. I think this is the most horrible plot that I've got in my whole talk, so bear with me. It's not as bad as it looks. We're going to unpack it a little bit. So what we're looking at here is lots and lots of data, all collected from that same project, SAFE project. And we're looking at a change in abundance or biomass. And what we're doing is we're comparing primary forest in green to logged forest, disturbed forest in orange for each of those different groups. So if these lines look different for one particular group, it means they're changing between primary forest and log forest. If they're the same, they're not. And if you sort of unfocus your eyes and look at the picture, what you'll notice is that for lots of these different groups, the response is different. So we've got a huge range of different taxa and different components of the ecosystem represented here, but they're not all doing the same thing. Some things are doing okay in disturbed forest, some things are going down. And again, you can begin to understand how habitats are changing by looking at this. So I'm going to focus in here and give you a couple of examples of why this is happening. So this one here, this is quite a random group, but I like this one. This is marasmoid fungi. So these are fungi that grow in the ecosystem and catch leaf litter before it gets to the ground. I'll show you a picture of it here. If you've been to a rainforest, you'd have seen these. So if you walk through a rainforest, you often get bits of kind of hair-like stuff stuck on you. We'll see this in Nottingham quite a lot. It's a really interesting habitat. And what it is all these fungi, which don't live on the forest floor. What they do is they act like a web and they catch leaf litter before it falls to the ground. And what they're basically doing is they're escaping competition with other fungi. They're catching the leaf litter before all the other fungi can get to it. It's really interesting. But when you look at the number of insect species in an area that's got these fungi versus those without, hopefully what you can see is you get far more insects, far more arthropods, because what the fungi are basically doing is they're making a new habitat for insects, not on the ground, but right up in the canopy. So it's one of these bits of a habitat which is more diverse as a result of this species being there. Unfortunately, if you look at the number of these fungi per area in primary forest compared to oil palm plantation, increasing disturbance, it goes right down. So this is one of the reasons, perhaps, why insect numbers go down as well. We're suddenly losing a whole bit of the habitat. So that's one example of something that drops with disturbance. But then there are other things, which are here. So termites and ants. This is work that Sarah did during her master's project. So kind of this is a young version of Sarah here. See how much has changed? Not at all. But what we're looking at here is Sarah's master's project. And she's doing the same project, the same landscape. What she's got is old growth forest, log forest, and oil palm, so increasing disturbance. And she's looking at ants on the top and termites on the bottom. And we've got really different patterns. So for termites, they're really vulnerable to disturbance. Their numbers are going right down. With ants, that's not the case. And again, that reflects things these animals actually do in the environment. If there are ecosystem functions which ants are doing, they're going to be much, much more stable than ecosystem functions carried out by termites. The different colours, don't worry about what they mean, but these are different functional groups as well. So each one of these different colours are groups of ants or groups of termites doing different things. Maybe they're living in the soil, or maybe they're dead wood feeders, or maybe they're kind of living only in ant nests for termites. They can do that. What you can again see, if you unfocus your eyes a bit, is that different groups do well or worse. And again, by bringing these different data sets together, we can begin to understand how whole suites of organisms respond to disturbance. And if you can find out which groups are more affected, again, that means you can begin to target how you might manage an ecosystem. It's kind of a lesson from this. We also did, in the SAFE project, lots of work on aquatic ecosystems as well. I just put this in because I didn't want us to think we just focused on terrestrial things. So one of the things the SAFE landscape's got as well is lots of different rivers with different levels of disturbance. One of the nice bits of work that Sarah and I have been doing over the last few years is looking at the numbers of these beautiful groups. These are semi-aquatic bugs in the kind of gerid group. So these are the ones that live on the river surface. And this is some really nice work from one of our PhD students, Martina Harianja. And what she did was basically look at the numbers of these bugs and the diversity of these bugs, again, with different levels of disturbance. This time the graphs are flipped. So 3 here is less disturbed, more minus numbers is more disturbed. And what you can hopefully see is for this group, again, they're really sensitive. Their abundance and their richness, their diversity goes right down as soon as you get disturbance going on. It's more nuanced than that, actually. But again, different groups of organisms responding in different ways, with some being really sensitive, some not being. And that's going to affect how the ecosystem works. So disturbance can certainly have a big effect, and that can have effect in its own right. It'll happen kind of straight away. There can also be things that happen later on as well. And one of the things that often happens with habitat disturbance for insects is that you'll get invasive species moving in, species which are able to cope with these changing conditions and might more or less take over. This is shown really nicely for oil palm plantation here. So this is work from Sabah from a long time ago by Tom Fail and colleagues. And what he did here was look at oil palm plantations and forests. And he looked at ant communities in the canopy, in those living in bird's nest ferns, so a type of epiphyte in this environment, and those living on a leaf litter on the forest floor. And he compared that between forest and oil palm. And he looked at ant species, which were either native, sort of native species, which are shown in green, or non-native species shown in red, shown in red, which one's here. And what he basically found was that when you look in oil palm, quite a high proportion of the community is actually made up of these non-natives. They're general species. And if you've been to an oil palm plantation, you'll see this. There's loads of things like yellow crazy ant, Anapelipis, that I come across, which are everywhere. Rather fewer of native species, completely reverse in forest. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing, they're often doing important things in the environment. What it can often mean is that they produce other changes. One of the things these things might do is predate on native species. So you'll see secondary effects. Once there's disturbance, other things can change too. And sometimes that can be quite hard to predict. So that's certainly two major drivers of why insect numbers might be going down. The other thing, which is the kind of elephant in the room, as we say, the really obvious thing, is climate change. And that's affecting ecosystems everywhere. This is the latest data from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. And what we're looking at here is the change in observed temperatures in black over time. This is sometimes called the hockey stick graph because it's going up so rapidly in recent years. This is the model change for natural temperature change. This is the model change for natural temperature change and humans. And what you can hopefully see is it matches perfectly. So climate change is very much linked to human activity, and it's happening everywhere. And we're seeing an increased temperature, mean temperature worldwide. We're also seeing an increased frequency of extreme weather events. And this can have real impacts on insects because they're often very sensitive to temperature. They're often very sensitive to drying out. It also kind of interacts with climate change. So we're worried about a 2-degree rise in temperature, 2 or 3 degree rise in temperature globally over the next century. That would be disastrous globally. If you convert a primary forest habitat here to an oil palm plantation habitat here, you get that change overnight and more so. So this is looking at temperature in the air, in the soil, and humidity, comparing forest habitats in color here compared to oil palm in gray here over 24 hours. So what you can see here is in the forest, in the daytime it goes hotter, in the nighttime it gets cooler, unsurprising, but it's much, much more severe in an oil palm plantation. So much so that by the heat of the day, temperatures are 5 or 6 degrees hotter in an oil palm plantation than they are in a forest. Again, this has a real impact on insects. And remember, we're seeing this as well as climate change. So managing habitats now for insects is getting harder because you're having to balance all of these different drivers. We've done quite a lot of work on climate change in relation to insects. I'm going to move you away from kind of Southeast Asia, and I'm going to whisk you to the UK now, which is where we do most of our work on insects and climate change. And this is some work which has really been led by this character here, this guy called Andrew Bladen, who I collaborate with a lot. He's at the University of Reading. And what we've been doing with the Wildlife Trust, which is a local conservation group in the UK, is we've been studying how temperature is affecting butterflies across a whole network of reserves. So these are chalk grassland sites in the UK, which are protected for wildlife. And what we've been doing is mapping out the habitats. So we go out with a little backpack GPS, or more recently, we've been doing it with drones. And we record all the different types of environment that are found on these reserves. And then what we do is we basically monitor these reserves for butterflies. We walk around and we GPS every individual butterfly we find. It's actually really good fun. One of the things I'm going to be suggesting for the field course, actually, you get great data doing this. It's really interesting. And when we catch a butterfly, which you can do carefully with a net, we take its temperature, which is really fun. And the way that people often ask, how do you take a butterfly's temperature? And of course, the right answer is carefully. but also with a very fine wire. So it's like a little tiny temperature probe. So what we do is we'll catch the butterfly with a net, we'll touch the probe on the butterfly on its thorax, and we can record its temperature. And when you get good at this, you can do it within 30 seconds. So we can release the butterfly within a minute. So it's actually surprisingly easy. It's much easier than you think. So with that, what we can do is we can suddenly look at butterfly temperatures in the wild for not one species, but 30 plus species. And we can see how temperature in the air affects butterfly temperature. Now, what we figured was, if some butterflies can control their temperature better than others, well, these might be the ones that are more resilient to climate change. We wanted to see whether that was the case. And that's what we collected data on. So we collected hundreds, like tens of thousands of data points in relation to air temperature for 30 plus butterfly species in the UK, about half the British species. And we could produce plots like this. So this is a pest species in the UK. It's the large white. And what we're looking at here is air temperature on the x-axis and butterfly thorax temperature on the y-axis. Now, if butterflies were doing nothing, they were just literally having the same temperature as the environment, they'd be sitting on this line. This is just a one-to-one line, just to kind of like to help you read the graph. These are the real data points we collected. So what does it show? Well, it shows for this species, when temperatures are cool, butterflies are relatively hot. When temperatures are hot, butterflies are relatively cool. So I came out there. So what you can kind of see is this species is actually pretty good at controlling its temperature. It can buffer itself. That's a really common species. This is a really rare species. It's absolutely rubbish at buffering its temperature, it turns out. So not only is it not very good at raising its temperature, as it gets hotter, it gets even hotter. So that was really interesting just for individual patterns. But if you bring all of this together, what you can find is that different families of butterflies actually systematically differ in how they can control their temperature. Some are really good and some are really bad. And it's in relation to wingspan. If you're larger, you're better at buffering your temperature. Put all that together, and what we've found is that the ability to buffer, or rather how you buffer, whether you rely on local areas of climate to change your temperature, determines how well butterfly species have done in relation to climate change over the last 50 years. So these things are important because now it suddenly means we're not just wondering how butterflies will respond to temperature, we can predict it. We know which species might be more vulnerable, which species might be less vulnerable. It's really fun to do this kind of work. Interestingly, we've followed this up. One of the things we're interested in, we've looked at adult butterflies first of all. We've recently had a PhD student shown here, Esme Ash Jepson, and what she did was follow it up for larvae. So what we've got here is adults in whichever round it is blue, and larvae in adults in red and larvae in blue. And what we found is for lots of different butterfly species, larvae are even worse. So they're systematically worse. So again, it shows us the different stages of the life cycle might be more or less vulnerable to temperature change, to climate change. So I'm more or less on time actually. I've done half an hour so far, so I'm reckoning I'm finishing up in about 10 minutes. Okay, all right, I'll talk more slowly. So what we've basically I've shown so far is why these kind of drivers are changing insect numbers and some of the work that we've done to try and illustrate why that might be. What I want to finish up with is a bit more of a kind of optimistic look, which is kind of what can we do about it, and some of the projects that we've been involved with to try and think about how that can be managed. One of the things that has come out of our work almost unintentionally is increasing habitat size. In the UK, we have the problem that most of our reserves, most of our habitats are kind of tiny. They're historically really small. They're tiny areas that be conserved for wildlife. So when we first started doing the butterfly work, way back in 2006, which is when Sarah did her undergraduate project with me, they were isolated, they were tiny. These are two of our key sites here, the two blue sites, and they were isolated by non-reserve habitats. They were small and they were difficult to manage, because managing a small reserve is hard. You've got to balance everything and keep lots of species in one tiny area. Partly because of our work and partly because of the fantastic work of the Wildlife Trust, the conservation organisation we work with, that's completely changed. And over time, more and more areas have been added into this habitat. So now rather than one or two small reserves, what we've got is one really big joined up reserve. And that's been getting bigger more or less year on year, partly because of increasing knowledge and local support, buying more areas around the reserve, so making it bigger and bigger. That makes it much more resilient to climate change and much, much more cost effective to manage. Another thing I think we can begin to do is think more generally about how to manage for insects. Traditionally, a lot of the work, a lot of the thought about conservation has gone into protected areas. It's basically how can we manage these small, isolated areas of forest for insects or other species. I think nowadays we need to be thinking much more generally. How can we manage for insects in agricultural landscapes, in the wider habitat, in gardens, in domestic areas, in the middle of towns? All of these kind of areas are important for insects. Part of our work you're going to hear more about from Sarah in the next talk has been based in Sumatra, in Ruang, and historically lots of work with Smart Trees, so Cinemas Agro-Resources Technology Research Institute. We've collaborated with for kind of 15 years on this project, and also the ipb as well, and the University of Nottingham that Sarah's based in. But we've got a project here which has been looking particularly at how you can manage the understory of existing oil palm plantations to increase insect numbers. Now, Sarah's going to tell you more about this project and more of the results, but I wanted to illustrate it here because what I wanted to sort of show was there's loads of scope. Oil palms last for 25 years plus, and you can do a lot to change the management. This is what our project here basically did. So this is what Smart Tree estates normally look like. They've kind of got some understory in it, and then they spray around the individual palms, and they spray along access lines. So it's varied. And one of the things we wanted to do with our project was basically to see, well, what happens if you change that? So we did what's called a backy design, before or after control investigation. We collected data on replicated plots before any treatment went in, and then after a year, we changed the management. Some areas we kept the same, some we had blanket spraying, which is what some smallholders do, some plantations do, and in the others we stopped all spraying, we allowed the understory to regrow. What we could look at was basically how did that affect insects? And we call these treatments reduced, normal, and enhanced. I'm not going to go through many results because you're going to get more detailed data from Sarah, but one of the things we could do is we could look at abundance and we could look at richness for a whole range of different insect species, arthropod species. 2013 is before this went in. What we've got here is the reduced, normal, enhanced treatments as pink, blue, and green. And then after the treatments here. And what we found was, if you compare before and after for reduced, both the number and the richness of butterflies here goes down in the reduced. It stays quite high in the other groups. So this little tweak in management, this change in how the understory is managed, can have quite a big impact on butterflies. And we found the same for lots of other groups as well. This is one of my favorite groups. I put this in. If you don't like spiders, these are your worst nightmare, I guess. They're quite common here. These are the beautiful Nephila spiders, golden orb weavers, which I think are just so beautiful. And these are quite important for controlling pests in plantations. They can be very, very high numbers sometimes. And what we're looking at here is, again, enhanced, normal, and reduced treatments, both before treatment and after treatment. And hopefully what you can see is when you remove the understory, these Nephila spiders basically disappear. It's quite interesting again. They're relying on this structural complexity. Now, of course, one of the things I flagged to you for that change from primary forest to oil palm was the loss of structural complexity. If you put it back in management, if you make plantations more diverse, you can reverse some of those declines. Interestingly, that also feeds through, to how well these things catch pests. So with things like Nephila, you can kind of monitor how many insects they're catching per hour by just walking around the plantations, which is also quite good fun. And this is looking at the number of prey captured in these big Nephila webs per hour. And this is work by Avento and Curator, by the way, who's at the top here. And what you can see is as you go from enhanced to normal to reduced, so lowering amounts of understory, you get a big drop in the number of these prey capture per hour, and therefore the number of prey captured per hectare. So it affects what we call the ecosystem function, how these ecosystems actually work as well. I've just put this in because Sarah's going to mention it a little bit later as well. But one of the recent projects which we've been doing with Budami and Papanama and other collaborators here is looking not just at managing the understory, but also working with Smart Tree to manage a larger plantation area. One of the projects we've been doing is replanting river margins experimentally and seeing how a really big change, putting forest back into a landscape, really increasing the structural complexity, how that can affect things as well. Another side of it, what we can do, I think, is understand more about insects. So right at the beginning of the talk, I kind of mentioned that insects are very diverse, but lots of the time people don't see them because they happen to be small. And part of that means that we don't really understand the ecology of insects as well as we should. And if you can understand the ecology, suddenly that can change everything. It means you can get the management exactly right for groups of species. This is one of the most impressive examples of how this can work. And it's from a butterfly called the large blue butterfly, which is found in the UK. And it was a butterfly that went extinct the year I was born, actually, in the UK. So we have it in our collection, and then it disappeared. And the reason it disappeared is because it has very specific habitat requirements. It's a very unusual one. I could give you the kind of life history of the large blue butterfly. So it's one of these things, it's a chalk-grassland butterfly, so it lives in the same sort of habitats that we work in the UK. And it emerges in the spring, so when temperatures start getting warmer. It breeds. The females lay eggs on a particular plant. The caterpillars hatch, perfectly normal butterfly behavior. They start feeding on the plant, great, that's normal caterpillar. But then after that, they suddenly do something really weird, which is they shed their skins lots of times, don't grow very much, and then they fall to the ground, as caterpillar, swell themselves up, and they start making squeaking noises. Very weird. It's not normal caterpillar behavior, this. And it turns out what they're doing is they're calling to ants. They're mimicking the cries of baby ants. And what happens is these ants go absolutely mad for these caterpillars. They take them below ground to their own egg chamber. They basically think that the baby ants have escaped somehow. Put them in the ant chamber, so in the nest with the rest of the baby ants, and there, to add insult to injury, what these caterpillars do is they start feeding on the ant larvae, their parasites. It's an incredible bit of natural history. It turns out in the UK, what was happening when these things went extinct was that the habitats weren't being grazed anymore. So the grass was growing up, temperatures were going down on ground level. The ants didn't like it because they like warm temperatures. Their numbers went down, and therefore the butterfly disappeared. It's an example there of how not understanding the ecology meant that this species went extinct. Now, this guy here is a guy called Jeremy Thomas, studied this for his PhD. He found out what was going on just too late to save the British species, actually. But then what conservationists did was change the management. They got the management right for those plantations, and they reintroduced the species from habitats elsewhere, from somewhere in mainland Europe. And this is what's happened to the population of these butterflies over time. They've gone from kind of loads to disappearing, reintroduction, and then this is the number of populations since that reintroduction. We've now got in the UK more populations than probably any other country in Europe. So this is the kind of habitat management that can really, really work. And it's just a question of understanding what species need. It's really, really important. We've done lots of work on this butterfly, Duke of Burgundy, where we've done more or less the same thing. We've tried to understand everything about its ecology. I won't worry about that now, it's a bit more in depth. The final thing I wanted to kind of think about was how you could manage for climate change. So, okay, you can understand what a species needs, you can change the management in an area, perhaps you can make reserves bigger. All of these things will help butterflies, but none of that will work if you've got climate change. So is there anything we can do to actually manage for climate change? And one of the things we've started doing in our group quite a lot, which is really fun, is we've started looking at whether you can manage temperatures on reserves, not at the big scale, but on the small scale, by managing for structure. This is not my data, this is data from an alpine area, but what researchers have done is they've basically looked at the area, and then they've taken a thermal camera image of the area. When you do this, what you find is the habitats are really variable in their temperature. Small changes like tree cover, slope, and aspect can really affect temperature of an area. So this is looking at this one area, it looks really similar, but when you look at the thermal image, actually some bits are really cool, some bits are really hot. And one of the things we were interested in doing in our group, in our research team, was understanding whether you could manage that to benefit species, to help protect them from the effects of climate change. And so one of the things we did is we've changed the structure of the habitat. So again, work with the Wildlife Trust, and we've literally brought in diggers These are new areas of reserve which have just been recently bought for conservation, and we've made our own banks. So obviously a model of them, but this is what the banks really look like. And we've changed the structure. We've done it experimentally. So we've got areas now which are north facing, south facing, west facing, and we've been able to measure whether this has an effect on butterfly distribution and how well butterflies can control their temperature. We've got some really interesting, it's only been going for a few years. It's work from Matt Hayes and Esme Ashepson you met before, so 2 students in our group. One of the things we were able to do was look at the effects of extreme weather events on this. We were kind of lucky in a way. We put in the banks, and the next year we had the hottest recorded temperatures in the UK of any time in history, which is 40 degrees centigrade in the UK, which I think is a real record. And what we were able to do was we were able to look at the temperature and what butterflies did in these really extreme conditions. And what we found was, we've got to show here, is this is a normal morning, a normal afternoon, so light blue, dark blue. This is the heat wave morning, the heat wave afternoon. And then we're looking at the number which are active, whether they're choosing shade, and whether they're sheltering in our banks. So this is on the site where these butterfly banks were built, in these different temperatures. What we found was really weird in the UK. Activity just disappeared. Once it got to the really hot temperatures, butterflies just suddenly stopped being active. None of them were flying. The whole field just went dead. And the only place that we could find the butterflies was where there was shade from our banks and when they were close to our banks. So basically putting in these banks saved butterflies from the impacts of this climate change. It's a really interesting result for us, the clearest results I've ever got from any project, actually. So I'm going to leave this bit here. We've started doing more schoolwork. I won't worry about that now. So what hopefully I'll try to do over the last kind of 50 minutes or so is really give you an introduction to why I think insects are interesting, why I think they're important for how ecosystems work, but also just important because of their sheer numbers, because they're so diverse, why their numbers are going down, which they certainly are in parts of the world. And then finally, what we can do about it and some of the projects that we've been doing to try and kind of make those links along the way. Thank you very much for listening to me. I've got a huge number of acknowledgements there, which include all the kind of fantastic collaborators here and elsewhere, and also all the different funding organisations that have made this possible, that as well. And obviously, thank you to yourselves for listening. Thank you.
Okay, so questions langsung aja. Mungkin ada about 10 minutes of question answer session. Jangan malu-malu.
Apa? Jangan malu.
Bahasa Indonesia nggak apa-apa. Bahasa Indonesia boleh, nanti bisa dibantu. Ini dong. Oke, silahkan. Kenalkan namanya juga ya.
Ya, terima kasih atas kesempatannya. Nanti mungkin bisa ditranslate oleh Ibu. Nama saya Briliano Doter, asal dari Maluku Utara. Nah, saya ingin bertanya terkait dengan bagaimana kita dapat melindungi keanekaragaman spesies. Nah, satu contoh kasus di daerah saya sekarang sedang gencar-gencarnya mengenai industri ekstraktif pertambangan. Nah, di daerah saya kami memiliki beberapa spesies endemik, salah satunya lebah terbesar di dunia, Megacili Pluto. Nah, saya khawatir ada karena perubahan habitat akibat industri pertambangan ini dapat juga mempengaruhi beberapa spesies endemik, bisa saja juga ke lebah yang tadi saya sampaikan, ke burung bidadari atau Simioptera olesi, juga spesies endemik di daerah kami. Nah, apa yang dapat saya lakukan secara pribadi? Tentunya saya tidak bisa melawan keputusan yang sudah disepakati oleh pemerintah pusat terkait dengan industri pertambangan itu. Terima kasih.
Oke, terima kasih. Bagus sekali pertanyaannya. Panggilannya siapa? Namanya panjang?
Billy, Bu.
Bill. Bill. Okay, so he's from Maluku. His name is Bill. And he comes from an area where there are many endemic species, like the megachilid, the giant wasp, and then also, lots of butterflies there. And
one can also see that mining industry is really large. It's getting bigger now. So he knows that he cannot fight the mining industry. But what do you suggest that an individual can do to help conservation of the endemic species?
So it's a really good question. There's probably several different answers from the stuff that we've done. I mean, in the UK, we have a very different context because we have hardly any endemic species. I mean, most of the ones we've lost already, actually. But what I've found is you can work a lot with industry. So I mean, obviously, we work a lot with oil palm industries. People globally are working a lot with mining industries. It's often easier if mining industries are making a big profit, because that sometimes means they're not so worried about putting some money back into conservation. So that's one conversation to have. It depends very much on the different industries. Globally, there's some really fantastic examples of mining industries putting habitats back. The biggest example I'm aware of, the most successful example, is from Australia, where historically the mining industry has been really devastating for biodiversity. But there's examples now from Western Australia, particularly, where mining organisations have put a bit more money back into conservation, and they're now returning habitats which are more diverse than the habitats they mined. So it can be done. It's not impossible at all. It usually requires an investment from industry. That's not really answering your question, I know, but it's kind of, I think involving the industry themselves is key. It's probably the short answer to that. That makes sense. I think more generally, with insects, there's quite a lot of stuff you can do around the edges as well. Because insects are small, individually tiny, they can often operate on a scale that individuals can manage habitat for. So if there's a small area of habitat which is kept and managed, you can keep species hanging on quite well. That's more or less what saved us in the UK from lots more species losses. We've got nearly all the habitat is agriculture, but small areas of reserves were preserved in time. And gradually what that means is we can begin to expand those reserves now and species can move out. So from an insect point of view, you can get individuals to do their own conservation work. If they make space for insects in an environment, these things can come back and they can do rather well in a small area. Longer term though, I mean, if you're from somewhere, it's always about local people being involved. Nearly always. I think that's true everywhere in the world. If you can get people caring about insects, so one of the projects I sort of ran out of time for, but this is one of the projects we've been doing in schools in the UK. We're really interested in school grounds. I mean, it's very local habitats. We've started working with schools to do their own biodiversity monitoring. So we set them up and we basically teach the school students how to do monitoring themselves. And then they do their own research projects. And this school particularly, what they did was restore an area of forest in their school grounds. Not a very big area, but it's one of those kind of small steps to understanding more about insect diversity.
Okay, thank you so much. Ada lagi? Okay, Aldin terus nanti itu ya, Aldin dulu.
Okay. Hello, sir. My name is Aldin. I'm from Plant Protection, and this is my first time I meet you. And next week we will meet again because I selected to join tropical course field in Malaysia. So I think this topic was interesting. We know that cause of insect declines like habitat change, pollution, or climate change, and we must take various steps to overcome these problems. So when did the project start? And my question is, how about the treatment progress, like butterflies project or experimental project that you have done in Malaysia or Indonesia? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I look forward to seeing you in KK next week. Yeah. It's variable. So most of our projects, we tend to work on large-scale experimental projects. And the reason we do that is because you get two reasons, actually. Ecology is always complicated. So doing comparisons between different habitats, you can find out if oil palm is different from forest, but actually everything else could be different too, because the habitats have always been different. They're in different areas. So part of the reason we work on experiments is you can change one management thing. You can increase the understory, you can change the topography, you can put in a butterfly bank, as we have in the UK, or you can keep a forest fragment or put it back in. And that means you can then look at the effects of that treatment very specifically. That does take longer, but it makes the evidence absolutely unequivocal. So if you're dealing with kind of land managers, so in the UK, for example, with the wildlife trusts and land managers, we can literally say, we did this, this is the result. And that makes it much more likely for people to change management. In terms of the timing, it's kind of variable. So the understory project in oil palm is based in Riau in Sumatra. And that went in probably 15 years ago now. And it lasted for about 7 or 8 years. The oil palm has now been replanted. So it's quite so long term. We're often talking quite long term. And with insect projects, you often need that in one way or another, because insect numbers go up and down hugely year on year. So things like that graph I showed with the 9% decline in insects per decade, one of the reasons that's so worrying is because it's really hard to pick up trends in insects because their numbers go up and down naturally. If you're picking up a long-term decline of 9%, it means they're doing that but going down. So often our projects are quite long-term.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity, first of all, and thank you for amazing exposure. Let me introduce myself. I'm Tira, and I'm from undergraduate student from plant protection. I actually interested with the cause of decline of insect population, specifically climate change. And as we know that climate change has a big transformation in for our environment. And Indonesia as a tropical country, and obviously it's different with UK. And for the question is what are the UK's challenge for specifically and the solution to protect the diversity of insect right now? Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much indeed. It's a really good question. So there are differences. So between the tropics and the temperate regions and the polar regions, there's been some studies, not my work, other studies, looking at the sensitivities of different insects. And interestingly, it seems like on average, you might expect the tropics to warm less on average as a result of climate change compared to the temperate regions, compared to the polar regions. So on average, temperatures are going to go up more in the UK than they are in Indonesia. So that sounds good, because the most diverse area, Indonesia, should be less affected compared to somewhere like the UK. Unfortunately, other work has shown that tropical species might be more vulnerable to temperature change. And that's probably because the temperature in Indonesia is more or less always the same. Whereas in the UK or temperate regions, it goes up and down. So insects are naturally able to buffer their temperature, to control their temperature more in the UK. That may mean that even though the temperature is going up more where I am, it's going to have less of an effect. It's quite interesting. So that's the kind of historic literature, and there's lots of people working on that kind of thing. Interestingly, we have started to do some work on this on butterflies, and we've got now that temperature probe work with recording butterflies' temperature. We've done that in the UK. We've also got collaborators in Panama who've collected it for tropical species, and also collaborators in Spain who have collected it for Mediterranean species. We've got some alpine species as well we've collected from Switzerland. And it turns out, really interestingly, you get exactly the same patterns wherever you are. So butterflies seem to respond in more or less exactly the same ways to temperature in Panama as they do in the UK, which we didn't expect at all. So it may be the vulnerability is much more equal for some of these species, or at least their ability to control their temperature is really similar. In terms of what you do, I think it does affect things. So wherever you are, putting in more shade can often be good. And there's been some work again from Panama, which has looked at the effects of canopy cover on butterfly temperatures. And having more canopy cover obviously controls their temperature more because it's a bit cooler under the understory. And you could imagine again in the future, that might be the kind of thing that becomes quite important for tropical crop management. So for oil palms, for example, perhaps leaving some areas of mature palm, not planting all at once, could mean you're giving some areas cooler habitat for species to cope with temperature change. In the UK, we're doing the same. So we're trying the effects of increasing scrub on reserves. And because we're in the northern hemisphere, we can also use slope. It wouldn't work quite so well here because the sun's always overhead. But in the UK, it's not. So north-facing slopes are 4 or 5 degrees cooler than south-facing slopes. So we can use that topography as well, which wouldn't quite work here. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much. Let's give a big applause to that. So I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Sarah Luke. She's an assistant professor at the Environmental Science, Ecology and Conservation at the University of Nottingham. And her research focuses on the impacts of land use change on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, and investigate options for improved management and habitat restoration. Okay, and the title of her talk will go straight. So let us, Sarah, the time is yours.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here. It's lovely to come and visit. As Edgar said, we're very pleased to be here. It's lovely to meet you. Lovely to be able to catch up with our collaborators that we've worked with for a long time. So, yeah, thank you all for coming. So just while we're setting up, I've had a brilliant introduction there to quite a few of the topics I'm going to cover in a bit more detail. So thank you, Ed, for laying the groundwork there, and I'll follow up on some of what he's discussed with a bit more detail, a few more of the results that we've got, and particularly focusing on a lot of the research we've been doing here in Indonesia. So I'm going to whisk you away from UK stuff, back here to work here in Indonesia in oil palm habitats that you will be perhaps more familiar with, and share some of our detailed research on that. Okay, so I'm based at the University of Nottingham in the UK, but as Ed says, have worked with the Cambridge group for many years now, and involved with long-term projects with them. Shall I grab the clicker? Right. Okay, yeah, I'm good. I've got the clicker in the right direction. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so the title of my talk is More Sustainable Management of Oil Palm Plantations. So as I say, I'm whisking us back to the tropics, looking in more detail at this oil palm agricultural landscape, and potentially how we can change management of it to help to boost biodiversity and other aspects of the environment. So I'm going to begin with a bit of an introduction to oil palm, just very quickly. I'm sure it's a familiar habitat to many of you here. We'll then think about possible strategies for increasing its environmental sustainability. And as Ed touched on, this is a lot about understanding existing variation within the plantations and how we can try to make use of that to boost biodiversity. I'm then going to go into talking about some of the large-scale and long-term experiments that we've been working on in collaboration with IPB researchers. And then we'll think about how all of this can go through to impacts on the ground. So I'm going to kick off with a brief introduction here, just to situate us. So here is an oil palm plantation, an overhead view here. Typically, oil palm is typically grown in monocultures here, although sometimes there's polyculture cropping. We zoom in a bit. This is what the inside of your typical plantation looks like, with the palms and obviously producing these oil palm fruits, which are a hugely valuable vegetable product for vegetable oils. Many uses for it. We've probably all eaten it already today. It's in many snacks and drinks, and maybe in our toiletries. So a very, very useful crop. And because of its use, because of the need to produce food for people all around the world, there's been rapid expansion of oil palm. And this map here just gives an idea of where the big centres of oil palm production are in the world. And you can see there's some big circles here right on Malaysia and Indonesia. So you guys here are the global leading producers of oil palm. And just zooming into here into the region a little bit more, this map shows some of the key areas for oil palm plantations. You can see Peninsular Malaysia, Sumatra and Borneo here are some of the leading areas for oil palm production. So not so much here around Jakarta, but just over in Sumatra is one of the leading areas. So on the one hand, as I've mentioned, this is a super important crop. We've got a growing world population. and it's risen really rapidly over the last decades, and it's still rising. So lots of people to feed, and oil palm is a very valuable crop for doing this. We've got all these people to feed, we need 70% more food, it's estimated by 2050. And oil palm is highly efficient. It's really great at producing this food that we need. If you compare it with other oil crops, per hectare, the average yield of oil palm is way, way higher. So you can see here, oil palm is that green bar compared with other common alternatives, soybean, sunflower, rapeseed. Per hectare, you can get so much more from oil palm. So it's a real wonder crop that's really fantastic for producing the food that we need. Super important. So from this paper by Mayer et al., oil palm is estimated that it meets 40% of our vegetable oil demand, but covers only 5% of the total oil crop area globally. And you can often grow it in lots of places that are unsuitable for other crops, and it's incredibly important for local communities. So a very important part of the economy here in this region and other tropical areas. So super important. But then the other side of the oil palm story, which again you likely to be familiar with, is the potential impacts it has had on the environment. It's been linked to deforestation to varying degrees depending on which part of the world you're in. This graph here shows different regions of the world, each point showing different sites. You can see there's a lot of variation in it. Some places there's been a closer link between deforestation and oil palm, and some areas less of a link, but there's definitely cases where there has been a strong link there, with knock-on consequences for greenhouse gas emissions and oil pollution, or air pollution, and of course biodiversity. And it's biodiversity that I'm going to focus in mostly on in this talk. And this graph gives a very good summary of what we know so far about how oil palm, conversion of forest to oil palm might be impacted by biodiversity. This graph gives a summary of several studies, with each arrow showing how the species richness and the abundance of different taxa changes as you go from forest to oil palm. So in each case, the base of the arrow here shows the abundance and the richness of that taxon in forest. And then if you follow the arrow through to the tip of the arrow, that shows the situation in oil palm. You've got abundance on the bottom here, species richness on the y-axis. And you can see the general trend for most of those arrows is that it's going down like this. So a decrease in abundance and a decrease in species richness is that typical trend when you go from forest to oil palm. I mean, we've got a few exceptions here. As Ed said earlier, insects are often doing lots of different things. There are different drivers for different insects, so there is variation in there. But the general trend is that decline. So definite evidence that we're seeing that with the conversion of forest to oil palm. So we've got something to balance here. So on the one hand, there are all those great benefits of oil palm. We said it's hugely important for the economies. It's a very efficient crop to feed our growing population. But on the other, we've got these impacts. So there is this key need to strike a balance. We've got to balance things out. How can we strike best balance between these somewhat competing demands? So this is a key question that we've been interested in our research group, and thinking how can we manage these habitats to try to strike that balance better. So some possible strategies. Let's think, what could we do to try to strike this better balance? And Ed touched on this earlier. It's about thinking, what is it about that change in habitat which is causing those declines? So what could we then change about that habitat to try to reverse those declines? And a key thing is this loss of structural complexity, as Ed mentioned. So this real scape of what a forest looks like compared with the oil palm plantation really shows that loss of habitat complexity as you convert it, including lower canopy, less variety in canopy heights, fewer epiphytes, and less leaflets. So I think that loss of complexity is a key thing. So if you think about that, remember that that's a key thing we can try to improve if we want to boost biodiversity. Similarly, again, temperature is a big one. So as Ed has also described, this is a key thing for lots of species. They're acting within very small temperature ranges. So if you have a big change in temperature, there's likely to be declines. So this work here from Insaba compared temperature and humidity in forest compared to oil palm, and found really big differences that when you convert, so you always have a bit of a bump in temperature in the middle of the day, but that bump in temperature is much, much higher in oil palm. So suddenly, if a species is in oil palm, it's got to cope with a huge hike in temperature in the middle of the day compared with forest, which it may struggle with. Similarly, humidity, forest humidity changes a little bit, but it stays reasonably constant. Oil palm, there's a big drop in humidity in the middle of the day, so very extreme differences of temperature and humidity. So that's something we could think about trying to do something about to try to boost biodiversity in plantations. So with those things in mind, some possible approaches for maintaining habitat complexity in microclimates and things that have been suggested are to protect forests whenever you can. So if you have remaining areas of continuous forest, including logged forests, then protecting them where possible is a very good idea for supporting biodiversity. And it's been shown that logged forests, even if it's been slightly logged, selectively logged, it's still very valuable for biodiversity. So just because something's been slightly logged does not mean there is no value there. That's the first thing. Smaller patches of forest are also very valuable. So again, even if a patch of forest is small, there's still a lot of value there, particularly for smaller species such as insects that we've been talking about. Forest fragment could actually be a very large habitat for them, providing a lot of resources. So that's a great thing to do to retain forest fragments. Also for travel around a landscape, they help to connect populations together. Thinking again about connectivity, riparian buffers, which are areas of habitat beside waterways, can also be a really great habitat feature to maintain in landscapes. So these, as well as being patches of habitat that things can live in, they also provide protection for the river, for the waterway themselves. So we've got the added benefit of providing protection for freshwater communities and for water quality, as well as for terrestrial systems. So another great possibility. And then we can go even smaller scale. So thinking within the within and between the farms themselves, right within the plantation, are the things we can do on quite a small scale to try to boost biodiversity by adding in structure, by buffering that microclimate, to try to help support more biodiversity and the associated functions. So this is just a few examples across a range of scales of things that it could be possible to do, things we could think about, how we can design that whole landscape to help to boost. So I'm particularly going to focus in on these two examples at the smaller end of the spectrum. So particularly riparian buffers and also management within the plantation itself, and explore some of the work we've been doing related to these. And I'm going to present work from a long-term project that we've been working on for, as Ed said, we're probably 15 years or so, I think now, the BEFTA programme. BEFTA stands for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Function in Tropical Agriculture. It's a long-term collaboration between academia, so various different universities, including IPB University and Cambridge and Nottingham, where I'm based, among others, and with the oil palm industry. So the company we're working with is Cinemas, and they have a research institute, Cinemas Research Institute, that we are working with. And with them, we've set up large-scale, long-term experiments, and we're doing a series of observations of the oil palm habitat. And together, we're testing the effects of plantation management strategies on biodiversity, ecosystem functioning, and yield. And we have been based at their plantations, at their research centre in Ruang province in Sumatra. So just over the water, we're just over in Sumatra doing this long-term work. And this is the structure of sort of our research programme with them, the BEFTA programme, and sort of how we're thinking about it, how we're thinking about the questions and the management, and then what we're measuring. So if you start on the bottom of the figure here, we've got these pictures at the bottom that are illustrating possible changes in management practices. We've got a range of ideas here, some of them, like what I just mentioned, the idea of sort of existing variability within the plantation, understory, riparian areas, a whole range of ideas for things we could do to change management. We're then interested in how changes in management feed through to changes in environmental conditions. So like I mentioned, how do all these changes affect the structural complexity? So that was the first thing we thought was probably really important for biodiversity within oil palms, how we can boost biodiversity, we can boost structural complexity, how it affects microclimate. So like we said, trying to buffer those microclimate changes that happen in oil palm. And then the third one, I've not mentioned in detail yet, but it's also very important in an agricultural setting, chemical requirements. How do these different managements affect chemicals, which are likely to have a knock-on influence to biodiversity? So we're considering management and we're considering effect on environmental conditions, and then how all of that feeds through to biodiversity, which of course affects ecosystem functions, and then all of that, how that affects yield and profitability. Because we've got to remember this is a productive system. These are oil palm plantations. We're trying to produce food. We want to produce vegetable oil. So we need to be monitoring yield and productivity to ensure we're still producing whilst also being as sustainable as possible. So it's about striking that balance, like I said earlier, between production and protection. So that's what we're thinking of in our project. And as I said, we're testing a range of different management practices. And I'm going to introduce a few of them in a bit more detail in this talk. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of our work looking at existing variability within the plantation. So just trying to understand the plantation a bit better, what's already there, how is it working, how is the ecology working, are different areas of the plantation just naturally different? So I'll present some results on that. I'll then go into quite a lot more detail about the BEFTA understory vegetation project. So this is a project where we've changed the understory vegetation, and this has been running for quite a few years now, so we have quite a few results coming through now, which I'll share with you. So that'll be the main bulk of the results I'll share. I'll also introduce to you the Verta riparian restoration project. So this is the riparian areas along waterways. We're still underway with this, so just to say, we've not got results coming through yet, but I wanted to introduce our setup and explain it to you and just show you what we're doing there. Maybe I can come back again and share the results for that when they're through. And then the additional collaborations, again, I haven't got time to share these with you, but just to note that ask your professors here at IPB all about the BEFTA Smallholders project. This is a large part of our extra collaborative work that IPB have been leading. So I'm sure we'll be able to share some of the results about this. So I won't share on those, I'll focus on the projects. All right, so a couple of results about understanding existing variations within the plantations. And I'm going to start with, again, a bit of insect work. And some work we did focusing on dragonfly communities, and we were interested in how dragonflies communities varied in different parts of the plantation. So we've got a graph here showing dragonfly abundance on the y-axis here, and two categories on the x-axis are the core part of the plantation, so right in the middle where the palms are, and then the other one is the edge of the plantation by the side of a road, where they often have ditches and open habitat. So even just within a short distance, the middle of the plantation to the edge, we've got quite different habitat. And we found that there were significant differences in abundance of the dragonflies in those habitats. So higher dragonfly abundance on the edges of the planting blocks compared to the core. So you might think an oil palm plantation, it all looks exactly the same. There's no variation, it's a monoculture. Actually, when you go in and look in the detail and you look, especially small scale things such as insects, you see that in one place we're getting more, in another place we're getting less. There's potential there to try to boost numbers if we can understand what their habitat preferences are. So that was interesting to see. And when we investigated this further, we think it's related to the presence of the ditches by the side of the waterway, because we looked at how the dragonfly abundance related to rainfall, and we saw how that was different to the core and the edge. And not just rainfall at the time, but rainfall 4 months before we did the survey. So we think it's all to do with, and it makes sense that it's to do with the dragonfly larvae needing the water. They need the water habitats in the ditches that are at the edges. And so we get this boost in the dragonflies in the areas of ditches when you've got that high rainfall. The abundance significantly related to the rainfall levels 4 months before, showing the importance of that water in that habitat. A similar example, this is led by Valentine here, PhD student in Cambridge, along with Bento, who we work with at Smarttree. They were looking at butterfly populations, and again, the same sort of question of what have we got in different areas, the core habitat, right in the middle of the plantation versus the edge of the plantation. And they were looking also at different times of year as well. So similar idea, and they looked in March, September, and they found differences between those seasons and between habitats and seasons. Differences in the abundance and also the behaviour of the butterflies in these different places. So this is just to show that we've got quite fine scale differences, different microhabitats, different things going on, different times of year. It's a complex system. You think oil palm simple, you think it's monoculture, nothing to play with here in terms of management, but actually there's a lot going on. So if we can harness some of that knowledge to change management, to boost biodiversity, then there's a lot of scope there. That's a couple of examples of that. We've also done work on looking at oil palm age and replanting and various other questions. So do ask us about that if you'd like a bit more information. But that's just a flavour of this part of our work. So I'll move on to the main bulk of the results I'll share are about the BEFTA understory vegetation project, which is a large-scale long-term experiment we've been running with the Smarttree team. So this is about testing the effects of changing the understory vegetation management practices. So as Ed introduced earlier, this is all about thinking about that vegetation that's under the palms. So in a typical oil palm plantation, you have the palms growing up, but on the ground you have a lot of vegetation, and there are lots of decisions to be made about how to manage that. Do you just let it all grow naturally? Do you clear it all completely? Or do you do something sort of in between? And you have different oil palm producers who do that whole range of different things. Some leave it completely, some clear it completely, and some do a mix. So we were interested in testing the effects of all those management practices, so one extreme to the other. So we did this experimentally, and we did this using different levels of herbicide use and cutting, with the reduced vegetation treatment shown in the white here, being chemical herbicides used everywhere, all the vegetation under the palms being cleared. The normal vegetation is sort of a middle amount, which is the standard practice for our plantation, where they just cleared around the base of the palms. And then the enhanced vegetation, no chemicals, just some manual cutting to keep vegetation down. And we had multiple replicates of this across the landscape. So we've got an experiment replicated 6 times across the plantation. And it was a randomized before after control impact study. And so we took measurements before we started the treatments and after the treatments. And with that normal control treatment maintained throughout. So they all started off like this, managed normally. So that middle condition, the normal standard practice, with intermediate herbicide levels. We then created the understory vegetation treatments. So out of those 3 plots, 1 became reduced, 1 became enhanced, and 1 stayed normal. And then we monitored this over time. So we collected data both pre-treatment, before, and after. So we could see the effect of creating those treatments. So as Ed was mentioning, the strength of an experiment to be able to really pin down the effect of a management practice is very valuable to really understand it. That's what we did here. And monitoring of these went on for over 5 years. So we have a large data set to be able to really try to understand the effects of this. To share some results of this, just to begin with, to show that our experiment has actually changed the environment, we'll look here at the structure of the vegetation. And I've blanked out half the grass here. I just want you to look at the start of the grass, which is everything this side is pre-treatment. So before we started the treatments, when everything was managed exactly the same, it was all the normal treatment. You can see all of these lines are about similar. So we're calling the plots enhanced and normal and reduced, but at the beginning, they're all managed normally. And we can see that at the beginning, they're all the same. So that means we've chosen plots that are all the same to begin with. So that's good experimentally, they're all standard and the same. We then started our experiment, and you can see that our experiment did indeed, oops, wrong way, that's not helpful, this way. Our experiment did indeed change the structural complexity. So the experiment we've done is a real change in the environment in terms of structure. You can see for all of these measures, apart from the canopy openness, changing the understory had no effect on canopy openness, which is as you'd expect. But for the fern cover, the frond heaps, the bare ground, the other plants, the vegetation, we've got differences between the treatments. So this shows that common management decisions about how much herbicide to use, where to use it, how much to do it, has a real impact on the structure, which, as we said, is very possibly, we think, very important for knock-on consequences for the ecosystem. So hold that in mind. We've got real differences in structure. And our data collection showed that this difference in structure then led through to quite a lot of changes in the biodiversity. So starting off with plant biodiversity, as well as structural changes in the plants, we also saw a big change in the number of species of plants and also the species composition of the plant communities. So this is work led by Debbie Pinomo, who botanist based at Smarttree, who did some excellent survey work of the plant communities and found these big differences in the number of species. With the species accumulation curves here, you can see the one on the top, the green, is the enhanced vegetation treatment. So that was very minimal use of herbicides. The blue one is the normal, where you've got intermediate, and the red is the reduced. So as well as just clearing the vegetation, you're reducing the species if you use a lot of herbicides. And you can see the big drop off in the biomass. I mean, as you'd expect, if you use herbicides, you lose the biomass. But as well as that, we've got a different mix of species in what is left. So the colours are changing here, showing the species mix is different. Some really common species from the enhanced and the normal plots just sort of disappear in the reduced. And if you think about ecology and ecosystems, any changes in the plants community is then likely to lead through to other changes in the community. And indeed, this is what we saw. So that was plants. If we think then about some of the other aspects of the community, here some examples of work on ants and leopard cats that was led by PhD student Millie Hood and also our collaborator Ruang, Smarttree. In both these cases, they found there was lower abundance of the taxa in the reduced plots compared with the enhanced. So in the case of ants, there was lower abundance of ground foraging ants in reduced vegetation plots. So with these box plots, we've got a little bit of a change over time between pre-treatment and post-treatment, but the abundance, so change over time, there was a little bit of a natural increase post-treatment, possibly because of weather treatments. We didn't get that increase with the reduced. So overall, it shows that the reduced plots have lower ant abundance. Similarly, leopard cat activity, that actually post-treatment, there was a bit of a drop in the leopard cat activity, again, because of just ups and downs in the population. But we had less of a drop shown in the enhanced plots, showing that the vegetation is helping to boost the activity, whereas in normal and reduced plots, we've got lower activity. So clear feed-throughs of our management strategy on ants and leopard cats here. We found a similar story with assassin bugs. So these are, you may well be aware, these are sort of potential key pest controllers, natural pest controllers in all plantations. Assassin bugs were found to have lower abundance in the reduced vegetation plots. We've got a big drop off here. So enhanced in green, normal in blue, reduced in red, all similar to begin with. And then after the treatment, we've got a big drop in the abundance in the reduced plot. This is particularly strong for this one species here of assassin bugs. We also got a drop for a second species, but it wasn't quite so significant. So definitely stuff going on for both species in relation to the reduced vegetation plot, and a bit of a stronger trend for one than the other. I should say this work was led by Edgar and another student based in Cambridge, Jake Stone here. It's complicated though, so those things were showing clear drops. We also have some taxa that aren't quite showing the same trend. So a couple of examples here of actually dragonflies did not show any change in abundance with treatment. We've got very similar graphs here, pre-treatment and post-treatment. So they're not quite responding in the same way as those other insect groups. So we've got variation across groups here, and perhaps that's something to do with their dependence on water that we found earlier. And also for spiders, so another potential pest controlling group here, that both of them are potential pest controllers. We didn't find much difference in spiders either. So no change in the ground sampled spider abundance with treatment. So we've got some things definitely going down, some things staying a bit more the same. It's a complex picture, but potentially quite a few changes going on. This work was led by Michael Pashkovich here, along with in collaboration with the Smartry team. Thinking a bit about functions, we've got a couple of examples here about soil functions and also leaf litter decomposition. Work here led by Adam Ashton-Butt in collaboration with the Smartry team. He found that there was lower soil macrofauna richness and abundance in the reduced vegetation plots, and also similarly lower leaf litter decomposition rates in the reduced vegetation plots. So another example of a clear difference that what's happening in the reduced vegetation plots compared to the normal and the enhanced. So just to recap, I've thrown quite a lot of graphs at you there, quite a few different results. We've got a bit of a mixed picture. So a quick summary on results coming out so far from BEFTA is that the experiment did indeed cause significant changes in structure. So just that small management change really changed that structure. And that led through to lower plant species richness and the changes in plant community composition and reduced vegetation plots compared to the others. So big effects on plants. And then we think that's feeding through to effects on ants and assassin bugs, and also the leopard cat activity, just a few examples of different taxa there. But then it's not the same pattern for everything. For example, dragonflies, spiders, we didn't see a drop. So it's a complex picture here. There's still a few more things to try and understand there. And similarly, different assassin bugs responding slightly different. We did get a drop there in soil macrofauna and the lower decomposition rates in the reduced vegetation plots. So some really interesting results coming through there from a range of taxa, range of functions, clear effects of the change in management, and a few things to unpick still. Okay, so I will move on to our second big experiment at the BEFTA programme, the Rare to Riparian Restoration Project. As I mentioned, this is still ongoing, so lots of many results to share here, but I just wanted to give you a flavour of what we're on ongoing work, and I guess a teaser of the results to come from that. So just a quick intro about riparian buffers and their potential benefits. So these are, as I mentioned, sort of strips of conservation habitat by the side of waterways. You might have heard them called riparian buffers or reserves or zones. And they're typically areas of non-crop habitat beside the waterway. Sometimes they're made of remnant forest. So if you still have forest in the landscape, maybe it's forest that's been left by the waterway. In other places, it might just be grassed, it might be, or it might be some sort of restored habitat. So they come in a variety of forms, but it's thought that they can bring loads of benefits. So there's big potential for helping to maintain freshwater biodiversity, maintaining hydrology, good water quality, also reducing the soil erosion from the waterway because you've got some protection by the side of the river. Because we've got vegetation in there, they're potentially good for carbon storage. You've got terrestrial habitat there, so it can be really good for terrestrial biodiversity, good for movement around the landscape as corridors. And there's also potential for them to be good for pest control into the surrounding plantation. So it could be a great habitat to support natural pest controlling species that can then spill out into the plantation. So potentially a lot of good things about riparian buffers. And with this in mind, we did a bit of a literature review to try and assess this and see how much is known about the benefits of biodiversity. And we focused on, the benefits of riparian buffers within tropical agriculture. And although we found quite a lot of papers that considered the impacts of tropical agriculture on riparian areas and waterways, we found 246. Only just over 100 of these papers explicitly focused on the effects of riparian buffers. So I guess that's quite a lot, but within that, it's sort of trying to get specific details we found was quite difficult. So this graph here sort of gives a summary of what we know about these questions and the benefits in temperate regions versus what we know in tropical regions. So this is a few years ago we did this now, so I think we've been able to update some of this a little bit, but you can see for all these different benefits in temperate regions, such as wildlife support, water quality, sediment, we've kind of got an idea of how wide the buffer needs to be. So the distance, the width of the buffer shown here, we sort of estimate that wider buffer is needed for that versus that. If you look at the tropical side, we've got a load of question marks. So the literature just is in its early days. We're still trying to find out information about the benefits of buffers and exactly how to manage them. So I think widespread benefits, but lots of uncertainty still about how best to design and manage. We are now, as I mentioned, that was a few years ago, we are now trying to sort of fill those gaps in knowledge. And some work coming out of Sabah in Malaysia has brought together several data sets from the SAFE project, so that Ed mentioned earlier, that try to address this. So I was involved in this work that looked at multiple taxa, you can see shown by these icons here, and looked at the species richness of all those different taxa in reserves, riparian reserves of different widths. And you can see across both of these graphs here, we've got quite a bit of variation across different taxa about how wide a buffer is thought to be needed to get a population that is anything like the forest population. So in both cases, the dotted lines going across ways on the top show the relative species richness in forest. So in each case, the horizontal line is the forest number in forest, and in this case, the vertical line, dotted line, is the number in forest. And you can see that the brown curves and the brown lines are for all species of that taxon, and the green ones are for the forest specialized species. And you can see that in a lot of cases, it takes quite a wide buffer until you get similar numbers of species as you get in forest. And in some cases, those lines never reach the forest level. However wide your buffer goes, you never get something that's quite like forest. In other cases, actually, a sort of medium-sized buffer might be enough to get a forest-like community. And we've got various estimates here of what the relative species richness is relative to forest of buffers of different widths. So the small circle here is if you had a 20-meter buffer, what you think you would get in that buffer, 40 meters, 80 meters, and you can see how that compares with your forest line. So again, for some taxa, we're way below the forest line, we're never getting forest equivalents. Other ones, way below here, but actually, yes, and then other ones you are, you're needing much wider. So quite a mixed picture, but I think the message is as wide as possible is good for the widest level of biodiversity. So that paper was sort of putting a few numbers on how we should manage it, but there's still quite a big remaining question about how best to manage these buffers. So this just thinks about width, but what's the habitat quality like? How do we manage within the buffer? And also in areas where you don't have forest left, how do you restore a buffer if you've lost it? So this is what we're particularly interested in with the RERTA project. So the RERTA stands for Riparian Ecosystem Restoration in Tropical Agriculture. And again, it's a large-scale, long-term experiment that we've been doing in collaboration with Smartry in Sumatra. And we're interested in testing the effects of riparian buffer restoration practices on the ecosystem. So making use of the fact that oil palm is replanted, and so there's a planned change in the environment, which allows us to go in and create different riparian buffers to essentially plant lots of trees and also keep mature palms as riparian buffers to be able to test these options. And the different options we've been testing, first one is this, a combination of mature palms and also enrichment planting with native tree species as one buffer option. You see on the picture here representing, so it's a mix of leaving big palms in place and planting trees. And we're interested in what the benefits of that will be for the ecosystem. So that's the first option we're testing. The second option is don't plant any trees, just leave the mature palms and see what the benefits of that are. So that's an option that's being considered by lots of plantations where they're doing their replanting. That's what they're considering as an option for restoration, just leaving those mature palms. So we were interested in seeing what the value of that option is. A third option we're testing is clear all the mature palms and just plant trees. So if you don't leave the mature palms and the structure of those, but you do plant the seedlings, again, what's the benefit of those? And then our fourth option is a control where we've replanted oil palm to the river's edge, and we haven't put structural complexity back, so it's standard complexity of the replanted oil palm, but there is, in order to comply with riparian regulations, there is no use of chemicals in that area. But it's a very simplified structure in terms of buffer. So those are our 4 treatments. And we've set this up across the landscape, 1.6 kilometre long experimental sites. So each of those treatments we've made 400 metres long, one after the other. We've replicated that twice across the landscape. And we set this up, one of them in 2018, the other one in 2019. I think we planted 10,000 trees. So quite a lot of seedlings went in to create these treatments, and we've been measuring and monitoring them ever since. So a bit like BEFTA, we took measurements before and after and all different points across the landscape. So areas that are within the buffer area, areas just outside the buffer area, and also way out into the plantation to be able to compare. Before after control impact study, took, again, as I mentioned, measurements pre-treatment and post-treatment. Pre-treatment, all of them were mature palm. So a bit like BEFTA, we started with just that standard treatment of, they all started mature palm, all the same, no difference in riparian area. Then the replanting happened, we could put all these seedlings in, we could maintain the mature palms, the rest of the oil palm was replanted, so we created these 4 buffer treatments. Created the treatments, and then we've been monitoring them post-treatment. So again, before and after measurements, see how this big change in the structure and management of the environment feeds through to the ecosystem. And as I said, this is underway, we've got results coming through, but just to give you a flavour of what it looks like, this was some photos from 1 year after planting. So already the seedlings went in, they started off just small little things, but in 1 year we're getting young trees coming through. 1 or 2 were big enough for Pargung here to climb up. So already in a year, things are really taking hold, and we're getting a lot more structure in that environment. So from just a completely cleared oil palm plantation, we're getting trees coming through. 3 years after planting, you can see we're getting a mix of species developing. We're getting more height here. We've got a tree with a much wider trunk here. So 3 years down the line, again, huge amounts of structure coming back in with this planting, with maintaining the mature palms. We go 4 years after planting, we were lucky enough to get a drone in and get an aerial view. You can see how these riparian buffers that we've created are different from that surrounding habitat. So all of this is our river snaking through the middle here. You can see a couple of the treatments are in view here. The first one here is our enrichment planting. You can see lots of trees growing up, and beyond that, you can see the mature palm buffer, and surrounding is the young palm. You can see this taking shape across the landscape. And then wrong way. And then just a couple of days ago, I was lucky enough to be able to go and visit this again 6 years after planting. And we've now got really tall trees, that we've got this forest growing back up. And I think this was one of the same tree that Agung visited back in the first year. It was just a small thing, and now suddenly we've got this big tree. So, I mean, the phenomenal power of the tropics for growth, it's so impressive how fast these trees have grown and what has been possible in just 6 years. It shows just such huge potential for putting that structure back in, creating that complexity. As Ed was saying earlier about the differences in height, all those fungal hyphae, all that leaf litter, all the deadwood, all those things are coming back in. I didn't have enough space to put all the photos on, but I was eagerly snapping pictures of all the dead wood that's on the ground, and we have the termite mounds and so on appearing that I've not seen before. So just in a short time, a huge potential for this complexity coming back.
What tree is that?
Is that Sengon, I think. So they're the fastest growing ones. So they've really shot up. So actually, most of the canopy here is the Sengon, but we have got a mix of 6 species. So you've got other ones hidden amongst, but it was the Sengon that really shot up. But even the others are really catching up now. So we've got a really great variety coming through. So as I say, I've not enough time, and also we're still just number crunching on those early results, but soon I hope to be able to share with you these early results of our first 7 years of data coming through soon. So I just wanted to finish off with thinking, right, we've done all this work, we've got all this data, we've got these results, but if we want real change in a big way over large areas to really help biodiversity and improve sustainability, we need to get the message out, we need to share our results, and we need to have roots to impact. So I'm just going to share a bit about how we're doing that and what we're thinking about that. So I think we see it as we've got roots to impact at different scales. We've got a sort of local scale in which we, with the people that we're working, the immediate managers that we're working with, the plantations we're working with now, we can increase awareness. And we can also disseminate results to other groups of growers nearby. So a perfect example of this is the work with smallholders that the ipb teams are leading here, sharing findings directly with those smallholders. Going a bit wider than that, we aim to publish our work, both in industry and academic publications, to try and reach a wider audience. And then ultimately, we're hoping to go as internationally as we can with our results and try to get them to feed in with national laws and policy and sustainability criteria. So we've already been starting to do this. So we have collaborations with organisations such as ICOPE, the International Conference on Oil Palm Environment, and that's a interdisciplinary conference that brings academics together and industry and government to talk about sustainability issues. So our results feed through to that. We've also been working with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, feeding into particularly their criteria number 5 about environmental responsibility and conservation. We've contributed to, we've co-authored management guides about riparian buffers, and we'll continue to update on those as our results come through. I've also been involved with developing tools for use by tropical land managers. So we're trying to develop tools to help support decision making, to try to support sustainable management. So I've been working with the Cool Farm Alliance on something called the Cool Farm Tool. And this is to help advise land managers about practices that can help to make their agriculture more sustainable. So it's an online tool. We've been running workshops with people involved in tropical agriculture around the world to try to feed into this and develop this tool so that people can see what they're doing, see how it's scoring, try to improve their scores, to improve their practices. So that is on its way soon. Got the methods just published, but the online tool's coming soon. And we've also been across our group and collaborations and collaborations with other research projects. We've been trying to share our experience about managing tropical agricultural restoration projects and other projects. And an example of this was putting together a paper where we identified 9 actions to successfully restore tropical agri-ecosystems. And these include working with a diverse network of stakeholders, considering economic benefits and costs, so as well as the biodiversity, of course, also the yield is important, collecting baseline data and the importance of that before and after, thinking about algorithms to inform priorities, the value of experiments, doing our best to cover different biomes and regions around the world, including traditional knowledges and practices. I mean, local communities and people in country and that diverse range of stakeholders have a huge range of ideas to bring in to be considered in terms of management practices, considering techniques for assessing and improving restoration, and also sharing results and data openly and widely. These were our top recommendations coming through for how to successfully do all of this. And crucially, all of this work has led to developing really long-term collaborations, sharing skills, sharing knowledge, sharing needs and questions together, and doing our best to try and answer new questions together. So a couple of group pictures from our team at Smartry. Still, collaboration still going strong after all these years. This was us in 2017, and just a few days ago, it was lovely to catch up with them. So yeah, great to work with so many people on these things and try to push things forwards. Okay, so to wrap that up, that whistle-stop tour of our research, we started off talking about oil palm and its expansion, its huge benefits, but also its impacts, and that need to strike that balance, manage it in that balanced way. And some options for this: maintaining forest where you can, small bits of forest, riparian areas, but also the small stuff within plantations and the value of that. There's lots of chance for sort of options where you can get that, you maintain the yield, but also boost the biodiversity. So I've introduced the BEFTA programme, this long-term collaboration we're doing with industry. Touched a bit on our work looking at the existing plantation and trying to understand that a bit better. Mainly focused on the BEFTA understory vegetation project and some of our biodiversity results from that. Big impacts of that high herbicide use, reduced vegetation treatment on a range of biodiversity. And then Rita introducing that recent experiment of ours where we've put those riparian buffers back in, really restored that structure. We're testing the options for different riparian management and the benefits of that. And we've got results coming on that coming soon. And thinking about how we then use all of those results, how we can use our findings to help influence policy and keep taking this research forwards, and the value of collaboration, working with a diverse range of groups and really sharing knowledge on this to try to finance this and get our evidence and results to have benefits on the ground. Okay, so I will also thank a huge number of co-authors who contributed to this work, and a large range of funders who have supported it. Particular thanks to ipb for their long-term support with this, collaborators at Smartry, and various universities involved. And I will leave it there and say thank you all for listening. Thank you very much. Very happy to take questions. But yeah, thank you for coming along. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Mungkin ada 5 menit mungkin untuk pertanyaannya. Jadi intinya apa ya? Tadi banyak banget ya yang disampaikan ya. Jadi intinya itu kan tadi menyampaikan bahwa palm ya. Jadi kelapa sawit mereka itu udah. Jadi pertama, kalau mau penelitian itu harus jangka panjang. Kedua, duitnya harus ada. Ketiga, gimana bisa kerjasama dengan perusahaan karena memang mereka lah yang bisa yang memang mempunyai kawasan-kawasan yang bisa main-mainkan. Tadi itu kan basically sungainya itu kan ditanam dengan beberapa jenis dan
anyway, menarik banget. Nah, jadi sekarang kalau mau ada pertanyaan, saya yakin pasti tadi mungkin banyak yang nggak ketangkep karena banyaknya informasi ya. Tapi kalau ada yang burning question gitu, yang satu penasaran banget, nah, Atun silahkan. Atun terus nanti sebelahnya ya. Atau mahasiswa ini dulu baru Atun ya.
I'm sorry I crammed a lot in there and probably went very fast. So apologies. I mean, I'm here for the next 2 days, so if you've got questions now, you can also come and ask me and email me. So,
Okay.
yeah, I'm sorry if it was.
Okay, so thank you for the opportunities. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Fizel. I'm from student of IPB University in Department of Plant Protections. So actually, an oil palm is actually an interesting topic. Recently in Indonesia, it was like the problem between the government and civilians. So in the earlier of the presentations, you were talking that oil palm has caused deforestation. So we know that it makes so much of carbon in it and makes 6 Celsius hotter than forest in middle of the day, and change forest to an oil palm was actually happens a lot in Indonesia. So I have 2 questions. The first one, how do we react to the government that trying to change our forests? And do you think there's another alternative for them for not changing the forest to be an oil palm, but more like how we do the oil palm plantation in other way, like in other place or in another way, because making the forest to be an oil palm can cause imbalance of nature, like the Mr. Edgar presentations before. Not only insects, but like mammals that living in there, pests, and more also been threatened. And the second question is, I'm sorry if I catch it.
Pertanyaan keduanya lebih terkait presentasi ya, kalau bisa ya,
Yeah.
jangan terlalu jauh dari.
The second question is, sorry if I catch it up wrong. So I heard you mentions about 2 projects. It was Reta and Beta. So which projects do you think is more effective to do for an oil palm plantations? The Reta one or the Beta one? And why? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I'll do my best to give some thoughts. So firstly, the question of clearing, do we need to clear more forest or can we boost oil palm production in other ways? I mean, it's a complex thing, sort of big decision making, sort of land planning over large areas. So obviously there's lots of factors involved. I don't know the details of exactly how much land is available where, but there's often the option of working with lands that.
Sarah, can you come over here so that the camera.
Oh yes, okay, sorry. There's often the option of maybe land that's been used for something else before could potentially be planted up with oil palm. So there could be options there. So rather than clearing remaining forest for more oil palm, perhaps there's other land uses that could become it. But I mean, it's a question for land planners, I suppose, not my main area of expertise, but definitely stuff to consider there. There's also the scope for, as well as bringing more land into production, can you make the land you've already got in production produce higher yield? So this is often what a lot of plantations are trying to do. They're trying to boost the yield within their plantation rather than planting more, boost what they've already got. So yeah, I didn't get a chance to go into it fully here, but we're hoping that if you can boost biodiversity, there could be some win-wins for yield as well. So perhaps things such as if we boost pollinators, if we boost natural pest control, a lot of things that you will be familiar with, perhaps we boost that biodiversity, maybe we could get an increase in yield as well. So potential with good management, there might be some options to boost the yield and deliver benefits for biodiversity. So that's another option too. Your second question was about Vector or Reta, which management practice. It's really hard to say, they're so different and they probably will be delivering different things within the system. And actually, am I allowed to say we probably want a bit of both? So the Reta delivers those habitat patches and sort of large areas and more conservation focused patches, but then it's also important to have what we call the matrix, so the agricultural area also being as hospitable as possible for the biodiversity. Because if you want long-term persistence of biodiversity across a landscape, it needs to be able to, as well as those small patches of land, it also probably wants to use resources within the crop, but it needs to be able to travel around. If you want long-term sustainable populations, you need that potential for more areas than just your small habitat patches to support things. So I think I would argue probably a bit of both. We want those bigger habitat patches to support some things and provide some resources, but also in and around the plantation, resources for sort of movement, for certain species that might need certain things there. You also, of course, want the biodiversity to be able to get into the plantation and provide those benefits that you might want, like pest control, the pollination and so on. So both, is that allowed?
Jadi jawabannya dua-duanya ya memang ya. Oke, bagus pertanyaannya. Atun, silahkan.
Okay, so I'm Atun from Budamisat.
Hello.
Hello, nice to meet you. So we know based on the beta results, we know that enhanced vegetation treatment, let's say, much way better than the reduced one. So based on this result, is there any standards about how many plant species that we can plant in the oil palm area, let's say in about 1 hectare of oil palm area, how many plant species that we can plant, and then how long this will be give a positive impact after planting, because we know if we offer these fundings to the large company, which we know they more care about the profit, I think it will be quite difficult, because for them, maybe they will say cut down some oil palm just for planting other plant species, like maybe something that it doesn't want to do. So how about this? And then the second one, I'm not sure this is okay to be asked, but because it's a bit off topic, but I'm wondering, is there any derivative products of oil palm that around the UK, like how British people there see about some products from oil palm, because we know that now European Union already make some strict rules about some products from oil palm. So thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for considering beyond this, like the wider implications of this. That's interesting. So first question about number of plant species in the understory. So with the BEFTA understory vegetation project, we've just let the understory regrow and we've not cleared it. So we've not been, so far with our work, we've not been specifically planting the understory. We've done planting for the riparian, but for the understory, we've just not removed it, basically. So, but I think that's a very interesting question for something, an extra that could be done. So we've just been, we've mainly just seen what's grown up and the effect of that, but there's definitely potential you could have that and maybe do some supplementary planting. So maybe that's an extra question we should investigate next. I mean, certainly the plantations do plant flowering plants at some areas, particularly to help to support beneficial predators, so to provide nectar resources for beneficial predatory insects that help with integrated pest management. So that's definitely something they do. So maybe more widespread planting of those could be very useful. So rather than just in a few places on the plantation edge, maybe we should have them in more places. But yeah, I think that sounds like another experiment we need to do. So yeah, very interesting. In terms of the wider context of this and views on oil palm, so there's quite a lot of awareness of what palm oil is amongst, I'd say, the public in the UK. So people have heard of it. They've potentially heard of some of the impacts with it. I'm not sure they necessarily understand the balance of it, that sort of what we were talking about, the need to strike a balance. There's less awareness about actually the big benefits of it in terms of the yield, how efficient it is, how versatile it is. So they've often heard some things about it and have some awareness and may have thoughts about changing their buying behaviour of products. So we have a lot of products in the UK that have palm oil in, just the same as everywhere. It's in lots of things in the UK too. So some awareness of it, but I think not complete awareness, and certainly not complete awareness about the complexity of the questions around it. So that's the public opinion, I would say. And then in terms of government stance, we're no longer in the EU since Brexit, so we're not following the same necessarily following the same EU rules. I'm not quite sure what the current government's thoughts are on it, so it's something I need to check. But yeah, no, it's very interesting to think about that sort of wider thought. It's something I didn't get a chance to go on in the talk, but sort of ideas about sort of communicating more with public and sort of information campaigns, perhaps, to raise people's awareness about how complex it is, and that it's not a simple story. There are multiple things to weigh up when making decisions. But yeah, so thank you. Hope that answered what you were thinking of.
Thank you. There's one question from the Zoom, if I can read.
Yeah.
Just the last question. It's more about semiochemical. So he's wondering whether research on semiochemicals can be done in a all palm ecosystem. Has there any semiochemical studies done on that, or would that be an interesting topic to be researched on?
I'm sure it would be very interesting. It's not something we've been focusing on, but again, really interesting to hear these other extra ideas for questions. So definitely something that it could be interesting to consider. I mean, we've got this set up now. We've got these landscape scale experiments we've done within the biodiversity. We've done our best to cover a really wide range of stuff. I gave you a few examples of a few different taxa. We've also, I mean, we've got a huge range of sort of birds, mammals, insects, all different sort of in the canopy, the understory, underground. So we're covering quite a range, but there's definitely extra questions that can be addressed. We haven't been able to do everything. But yeah, so I'm afraid I can't give any specific answers about any findings on that, but please come and collaborate. Anyone who's got ideas, who would like to come and do projects, we very much do welcome collaborations, student projects. I mean, we can talk about the students who are working in the smallholder projects at the moment, and yeah, we're very open to more projects. So please bring your ideas. We're always open to extra people getting involved.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you so much. Kita tepuk tangan lagi buat Ibu Sarah dan Prof. Jadi untuk hari ini sudah selesai. Ada pertanyaan di Zoom tapi udah lewat kita ya. Udah 2 jam dan saya juga lihat wajah-wajah juga mungkin udah challenge. Ini ada kuliah lagi ya? Udah enggak ya? Aku udah mikir pada kuliah harus lari semua. Okay, so para mahasiswa gimana? Dapat tamu dari luar negeri untuk jadi dosen, kira-kira tertarik untuk sekolah lagi? Kalau mau melanjutkan S2, Master Program, bisa ke Cambridge atau ke Nottingham. Ya. Kemudian di sini ada Mas Jamal, yang tinggi itu namanya Mas Jamal. Mas Jamal dari mahasiswa dari Universitas Nottingham. Dia sedang mahasiswa S3. I'm introducing Mas means brother, so your brother Jamal, a big brother, yeah. And ada Mbak Becky, ini postdoc dari Cambridge, jadi memang sudah lulus doktor dan sekarang menjadi peneliti di Cambridge ya. Jadi kami ada kedatangan 4 tamu. Di samping itu kita juga ada mahasiswa. So we have a international student from Japan. I forgot your name, Kimo? Komi. Okay, Komi is our international student from Japan, and she's taking agroecology course. Tapi dia mahasiswa di Fakultas Pertanian, kalau nggak salah ya. Okay, so ada mahasiswa lain yang di internasional? Enggak? Okay. Okay, so thank you so much for coming and hope you've enjoyed the seminar, and thank you again to Ed and Sarah. Oke, sampai ketemu lagi. Terima kasih ya, dan wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Oh, Pak Ruli mau ngomong sesuatu ke mahasiswa?
Maybe this statement remark on both of you, because the student, most of student coming here is taking the biological control and habitat management. Please describe about how important insect ecology or insect conservation for the insect biological control. Maybe you can describe about the something.
I think that integrating insects into that production, so integrating insects into, it's much easier. So integrating insects into biological control and indeed into pollination. I mean, I described insects in terms of the number of functions they support, and that's because their number and because of the number of different things they do, their functional importance. They've been described by a researcher called E.O. Wilson, who wrote a wonderful book about ants, but as the little things that run the world. And insects really are the little things that run the world. If we can understand how insects work and how to manage them, we can genuinely, I think, increase crop production and increase profitability, going back to the question about getting oil palm industries involved on less land area. And that's absolutely key. We're heading towards a world with 9 billion people in it, quite fast. What we need to be doing is increasing production per area, but without that coming at a greater cost. That is possible. But part of that is making sure we manage the land we've got as effectively as possible. And understanding insects and understanding pest management is an absolutely key part of increasing yield per area. It's absolutely crucial. And the place that's going to win or lose is the tropics, is places like Indonesia. So what the course you're doing, the work you'll do is absolutely key to that, I think.
Thank you so much. Jadi kalau mau dikaitkan dengan pengelolaan habitat, kan pengendalian hayati dan pengelolaan habitat. Tadi dari presentasi Sarah juga sudah menunjukkan bahwa semakin kompleks struktur, jadi strukturnya. Jadi ketika landscape itu strukturnya makin kompleks, makin banyak, alias vegetasinya makin meningkat, itu kemudian biodiversity-nya juga kemudian makin beraneka ragam. Walaupun tidak untuk semua taksa, jadi tergantung taksanya apa. Tapi dari kuliah ini sebenarnya bisa terlihat cara pengelolaan habitat untuk kelapa sawit, ya itu seperti apa, dan ternyata understory jadi penting, restorasi kawasan sungai menjadi penting gitu. Nah pertanyaannya, apakah perusahaan mau ya, punya uang, apakah kalau masyarakat petani kecil mau mengelola habitat? Jadi sebenarnya kalau dari studi-studi sudah ketahuan bagaimana mengelola habitat sawit yang positif terhadap serangga itu sudah ada data. Nah, tapi implementasinya bagaimana? Jadi kaitannya ke pengelolaan PH-PH, saya tadi melihat kuat sekali. Banget ya. Yeah. So this is a very good input for the students to understand better the interaction between how management can actually conserve the insects, and they're looking more at the beneficial insect like the parasitoids, the predators, yeah. Dragonflies are predators, yeah. I haven't really heard about that fungi, so this is the first time I said, wow, really, even that in fungi.
So the fungi are really interesting. And again, one of those things, I think they've been very little studied. They're one of the things actually I'm suggesting as a good student project for the field course next week, because you can study them really easily, and they are in plantations. So it's very likely that things like, actually they're in Rota as well. I've seen them in the Rota plots. And that's the sort of thing where it's a small, tiny change in management. You say, so there's little small habitats for insects. You just tweak the management and suddenly you can have a big benefit. And I think the other side of the integrated pest management stuff with the parasitoids and everything else, historically, people have always thought about agriculture and conservation. And these things compete with each other. They're not the same, but really that's not the case. If you can make agriculture more productive and more sustainable, that benefits conservation. They're not, we need to stop thinking about them as being separate things. Oil palm is neither good nor bad for the environment, it's both. And I think that's the kind of approach we need to be moving towards, because that means you start making decisions at a global scale, at a large scale, which are much more effective. So if you can increase production for oil palm, it spares forest, it increases biodiversity. If you increase biodiversity within oil palm, it's going to probably help ecosystem functions and yields. And all of these things will make the crops more sustainable in the long term. And that's really, it's tricky. It's not impossible. It's really interesting to think about as well.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a good way also to change the thinking of the NGO, because sometimes the NGOs are, like his question, it's very, yeah, in Indonesia, there's so many that the bad campaign really affects. So this kind of research can show it's not, it's good or bad, but how we can, the management itself can change.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks again, and terima kasih banyak. Sampai jumpa lagi di lain waktu. Pak Ruli, terima kasih mahasiswanya sudah dihadirkan. Ya, nggak ada snack ya, maaf ya.
Dari snack.